Hi, I'm Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about the United Nations in Edexcel A Level Politics. I'm going to start by looking at the parts of the specification this video covers, before having a look at some past and possible essay questions you could get on the United Nations. From there, I'm going to give you an introduction to political global governance and an introduction to the United Nations, before looking at its origins and development, and four key institutions: the UN Security Council, including some key debates over the veto that the P5 members have, the UN General Assembly, the Economic and Social Council, and the International Court of Justice. The notes you can see on your screen are part of an updating textbook on the global politics part of the Edexcel A Level Politics specification that you can purchase on the Politics Explained website if you're interested, where you can also find loads of other resources to help you in your Politics A Level, including updating textbooks for every single part of the course so that they're constantly updated with new examples so that they're relevant and up to date, as well as essay plans covering every single part of the course, a place to sign up for tutoring if that's something you'd be interested in, and a place to also sign up for the waitlist for some live revision webinars we're going to be doing before the 2025 exams. But yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So starting off with the parts of specification these notes cover. So this is the first video on topic 2 of the Global Politics series. So it's global governance, political and economic, and the United Nations kind of comes over political global governance. So we're going to have a look at the United Nations, its origins and development, as well as the role and significance of the Security Council and the other key institutions, the General Assembly, Economic and Social Council, and the International Court of Justice, and we're going to look at the strengths and weaknesses of each of those. And I thought it's also worth including, because it's really very relevant, another key thing that the specification has asked us to look at in 2.3, and that's how the veto and membership and structure of the UN Security Council in particular prevent it from addressing effectively conflict, poverty, human rights, and the environment. In terms of some potential essay questions that you could practice, so these 12 markers and 30 markers cover the whole of topic 2, so that's global governance, political and economic. And the ones in bold, there are 12 marker plans and essay plans on the Politics Explained website, really detailed ones covering all of them. And if you plan those ones in bold, you should be really well prepared for the exam. Even if different questions come up, you should be able to adapt the content you know from those detailed plans into the different questions. In terms of specific questions you could get on the United Nations, so in terms of the 12 markers are always focused on differences or similarities between two different institutions or two different concepts. For example, so examine the differences between the role and significance of the United Nations and NATO. And I think that's potentially quite common, quite likely, because they're both the political global governance institutions. You also look at the criticisms of both the UN Security Council and NATO. And you could also get the UN being compared to the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, or you could potentially even get two different institutions of the UN being compared, but I think that's a little bit less likely. In terms of the essay questions, so evaluate the view that the United Nations is ineffective and outdated. So you could get one of these general questions on the United Nations or on the United Nations Security Council in particular. And then, of course, you're also going to be able to bring it into lots of other questions and more general ones that could be asked on political global governance, or the UN is really going to be useful across a range of topics where you can bring it in, whether that's in relation to political globalization, for example, the advantage and disadvantage of globalization. The UN is a key part of political globalization. So there's and also later on in other topics as well. So there's lots of areas it could be brought into, so it's a really important topic. Yeah, let's start by having a look at an introduction to political global governance, just because this is the first video in this subsection 2 of the specification. So political global governance, what we speak about, refers to the institutions and system through which states coordinate to address global issues that transcend national borders. So there's no world government that possesses full sovereignty and control over global decisions. Instead, there's a number of intergovernmental organisations which bring states together and give them a place to resolve conflicts and work together to tackle global challenges such as international security, climate change, and human rights. In national politics, the government uses the threat of force to collect taxes and make us do what we have to do, make us follow the law. You can't simply decide to opt out of the law. But that's different because there's no world government in terms of states. So it really does rely, global governance, on the voluntary cooperation of states and their willingness to work together and recognition it's in their mutual benefit, which liberals would argue naturally happens, and realists would potentially disagree. In terms of the United Nations, then, the origins of the UN very much come after World War II, with the primary aim of preventing another such global conflict and promoting peace and cooperation among the nations. So it was first established in October the 24th, 1945, after 50 countries met in San Francisco. And the United States is really key to the founding of the UN. And it's effectively the successor to the League of Nations, which was founded after World War I and ultimately failed in preventing another world war. The US was really important in pushing for the UN, which it saw as essential for safeguarding peace, promoting human rights, and addressing global challenges through multilateral cooperation. And the US's influence can really be seen in the dominance of its allies at the time in the Security Council. So actually, when it was founded, China, before it became communist, was one of its allies. The Soviet Union in the post-World War II era couldn't really be excluded. It wasn't yet in the Cold War. They'd obviously been allies during World War II, and France and the United Kingdom. We'll look at those kind of P5 members, permanent members of the UN Security Council in more detail later in the video. The official framework and treaty of the United Nations is the UN Charter, and it outlines the purposes, principles, and structure of the organisation, serving the legal framework for the UN's operations and its role in global governance. You don't need to know it in loads and loads of detail. It's just really useful to go through some of its key articles because they really teach us about what the role of the UN is supposed to be. So Article 1 sets out 4 key purposes of the United Nations. And the first one, and the most important one, is to maintain international peace and security. And that's to collectively remove threats to peace. Say there's one rogue state that's threatening the global order and threatening peace. That's where the United Nations Security Council can authorise intervention against them, and trying to also to bring together countries so that disputes are resolved through negotiation and discussion rather than through war. To develop friendly relations among nations based on the respect for principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. To achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian character, and to be a centre for harmonising the actions of nations in the attainment of these contents. So it's supposed to be this centre where states come together and really try to prevent conflict and work together to tackle shared challenges. Article 2 then sets out key principles of the United Nations, and this is really important in setting out the principle of sovereign equality of all member states. So the sovereignty of states over their territory and population should be respected, and states shouldn't be compelled to act if they don't consent to doing so. And this point 7 is really important to that. Nothing in this present charter shall authorise the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. So that's that internal sovereignty. We looked at actually the first video on global politics on the Politics Menu channel. Or shall require the members to submit such matters to settlement under the present charter. This principle shall not prejudice the application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7. Then, just quickly looking at the structure of the United Nations. So the Charter also defines the structure of the United Nations, including its 6 main organs: the General Assembly, Security Council, ICJ, Secretariat, Economic and Social Council, and the Trusteeship Council. So the Security Council is the most important one, as it's given significant powers and plays a significant role in maintaining peace, with the authority to impose sanctions, authorize military action, and oversee peacekeeping missions. So it's really the kind of most important institution that carries out the UN's most important goal of maintaining international peace and security. If we look then at the development of the UN since its founding, so in the 1950s and 60s, the process of decolonisation led to a sharp increase in UN membership, particularly from newly independent African, Asian, and Caribbean countries. So they joined, seeking a voice and support for their development and newfound sovereignty. The UN advocated for self-determination and increasingly focused on fostering economic and social progress to tackle global inequality, as a lot of these countries after decolonisation, due to colonisation and the continued structure and inequality in the world, were a lot poorer than the rest of the world. So by the 1960s, the General Assembly had therefore become more representative of global interests, with a growing emphasis on poverty alleviation and anti-colonialism. During the Cold War, the UN's work was made a bit more difficult, and really shaped, as the whole world was, the whole of global politics, by the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, which often led to gridlock in the UN Security Council. However, the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, as we'll look at even more in future videos that look at humanitarian interventions in particular, saw a surge in UN activity and membership from former Soviet republics and Eastern European states, and because there was no longer the gridlock between the United States and the Soviet Union, or now Russia, there was an increase in peacekeeping missions, as there was no longer going to be a blocker. They weren't taking different sides in different conflicts, as the Soviet Union, or now Russia, was nowhere near as powerful. And the UN took a really interventionist role in conflict resolution in a number of different places in the world. Another significant wave of membership then occurred after the breakup of Yugoslavia and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, leading to the addition of new states like Croatia, Slovenia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. So you really saw an increase in membership over that period, to a point where today almost every state in the world is a member of the United Nations. So there are 193 member states, so it encompasses almost all countries, making it the most universal international governmental organisation. It remains central to global diplomacy, addressing issues including climate change, nuclear disarmament, and global pandemics, while continuing to adapt to the needs and concerns of an increasingly globalised and connected world. The three countries aren't member states. First one is the Vatican City, so it holds permanent observer status, but due to the fact that it wants to kind of maintain a neutral diplomatic position as effectively a religious organisation, religious country, it doesn't have permanent member status. And the other two are due to effectively contestations over sovereignty and over borders. So Taiwan, the Republic of China, was originally a founding member of the United Nations as the Republic of China. It was effectively China's seat, but that switched in 1971. Then the People's Republic of China, what we know as China today, the mainland China, replaced Taiwan and took its seat. So now Taiwan's not officially recognised by the UN due to the fact that both Taiwan and the People's Republic of China claim to be the Chinese government, and there can only be one, which is now what we see as the Chinese government, mainland China, effectively. Obviously, mainland China claims that Taiwan is still a part of China. Taiwan very much, the Chinese government, especially at the moment, very much claims that it's not. Palestine is another one. It's a non-member observer state at the UN. So in 2012, the General Assembly voted to recognise it as a non-member observer state, granting it some rights. It's not yet a full member due to the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the fact that the Palestinian state and the Israeli state claim a lot of the same land, and crucially the fact that the United States, which has a Security Council veto, strongly supports Israel. So it's really kind of prevented that recognition of Palestine as a state. Okay, so that's a bit of an introduction to the United Nations. What we're going to have a look at now is the most important UN institution, the one that you're probably going to get asked about most, or most likely to bring up in your 12-marker and 30-mark essay answers, and that's the UN Security Council. So it's one of the 6 principal organs of the United Nations, responsible for maintaining international peace and security, which is the UN's most important aim. It's unique within the US system due to its unique ability to make legally binding decisions. We'll see later on in the video the UN General Assembly doesn't have this power, despite effectively being like the parliament for the United Nations. So it can impose sanctions, authorise the use of force, and authorise the establishment of peacekeeping missions. Its key aims, as really are a lot of the key aims of the United Nations as a whole, are maintaining international peace and security, promoting collective security, so that the global security would no longer depend on individual countries acting alone, such as the United States. Instead, countries would come together and act as if an attack on one member could be met with collective action by all, and to enforce international law. In terms of its membership, so since it was established, the UN was established, it's had 5 permanent members, so that's what we call the P5, with a veto power and a number of non-permanent members. So today the Security Council has those 5 permanent members who have remained exactly the same. So the United States, United Kingdom, Russia, which is originally the Soviet Union, China, which actually switched when China switched in a way from the Republic of China, Taiwan, in 1971 to the People's Republic of China, which is what we call China today, we understand as China today, and France, and each P5 member holds veto power over any substantive decision. And there are always 10 non-permanent members, and these are on a rotational basis. So they're elected by the General Assembly for 2-year terms, and they're distributed based on regional representation. There are 5 from Africa and Asia, 1 from Eastern Europe, 2 from Latin America and the Caribbean, and 2 from Western Europe and other regions. So the current non-permanent members as of 2024 include countries like Albania, Brazil, Ghana, and the UAE. There's a competition, as I said, changes every 2 years through elections, though those 5 permanent members don't ever change. How then does it operate? So as I've said before, it's the UN's most powerful body with the authority to make decisions that other member states are obliged to follow. It can convene at any time when peace or security is threatened, and its decisions, particularly on sanctions and military action, carry significant weight in the international community. In terms of how it makes decisions, so for any substantive resolution to pass, it requires at least 9 votes out of the 15 members, and this includes, because they've all got a veto, support from all 5 permanent members. So if any one of the P5 members vote against a substantive resolution, it's automatically rejected, even if it has majority support from all other states. When it comes to the use of force or sanctions, the UNSC first seeks to resolve disputes through peaceful means, including negotiations and mediation, but it can authorise both sanctions, these may be economic, diplomatic or military measures intended to pressure a country to comply with international law and what the UN Security Council wants, or military action. So it can authorise the use of armed forces or peacekeeping missions to enforce its decisions or restore stability. The Security Council oversees peacekeeping missions where UN troops, often from member states, always from member states actually, are deployed to conflict zones to monitor ceasefires, provide humanitarian aid, and ensure peace agreements are respected. These are authorised by the UNSC, often following a resolution that outlines the scope and mandate of that peacekeeping operation. The veto power is really the most controversial aspect of the UN Security Council. It gives any one of the P5 members the ability to block any substantive resolution, regardless of majority support. So it can really protect itself in doing so and protect its allies, even if the rest of the international community really condemn itself or its allies. It's been used many times throughout the Council's history, particularly during the Cold War, when the US and the Soviet Union frequently blocked each other's resolutions. France and the United Kingdom haven't used the veto since 1989, reflecting their decreased power in the international community. They, of course, could have used it, but it would be very controversial for them to do so, and they maybe would have seen the wrath of other countries, particularly the United States, and therefore haven't done so. China hasn't vetoed without Russia since 1999. That's really reflecting the fact that, especially in the last kind of 5 or 6 years, they've become increasingly aligned as well. The US and Russia have used the veto power really regularly, though, particularly in relation to the Middle East, as we'll look at in some of the case studies in a bit. The veto can crucially lead to gridlock, preventing the UNSC from acting decisively in crises where P5 members have conflicting interests. It was designed to ensure that no major power would be forced into action against its will, preserving the post-World War II balance of power. So you could argue it has its benefits as well. In terms of the strengths of the UN Security Council then, firstly is it can rapidly respond to global crises. So it's able to convene quickly and respond to global crises, unlike other UN bodies which require more time and extensive deliberation, particularly like the UN General Assembly, which represents all 193 member states. And this is really crucial when handling conflicts, humanitarian emergencies, or situations where they kind of require an urgent response. The Council's ability to authorise peacekeeping missions, impose sanctions, or mandate military interventions allows it to take decisive action to prevent the escalation of violence. Crucially, as it kind of really does represent the key powers in the international community, and as it has always has members from different regions, because the non-permanent members ensure that regional balance. In a way, it can kind of really have legitimacy. If it makes a decision, it can be seen as having legitimacy from the international community, as being representing the international community. So yeah, its decision, particularly when they're supported by a broad consensus, are considered binding on all UN member states, making them more powerful than decisions from other international institutions, because the UN Security Council is the only body in the United Nations that can kind of effectively make legally binding decisions. And this strengthens the effectiveness of actions taken by the Security Council, such as sanctions or peacekeeping operations. Similarly, though, the veto power ensures that no major power is forced into action against their will, therefore preventing the escalation or threat of nuclear war that could occur as a result. And then finally, one of its strengths can be seen as its peacekeeping and conflict resolution mechanisms. So its peacekeeping missions and conflict resolution are another major strength. Through its ability to deploy these peacekeeping forces, it's helped de-escalate conflicts, monitor ceasefires, and facilitate peace agreements. We'll look at some examples of that in a minute. And UNSC's role in approving and overseeing these missions demonstrates its capacity to provide on-the-ground conflict management and humanitarian aid in war-torn regions. On the other hand, there's a number of weaknesses of the UN Security Council. The first is the veto power, and that it really creates gridlock. So it's one of the most significant weaknesses of the UN Security Council is that often in situations where meaningful action is needed, it's blocked due to geopolitical interests of one of the P5 members. A single veto can prevent the adoption of a resolution, even if the majority of Security Council and UN General Assembly support it. On pretty much any global issue, you can assume that one of the United States or Russia is going to disagree with it and veto it because they're always on different sides. This frequently leads to inaction during critical global crises. Syria, the Syrian civil war is a really key, just come to an end actually, but it's a really, really key example of that, as we'll look at in the case studies in a bit. Really big issues with representation and legitimacy. So on the one hand, it can be seen as when they do make decisions, they can be seen as having some global legitimacy. But the P5 structure reflects the post-World War II global order. It doesn't really adequately represent the whole world or the current distribution of power and influence in global politics. So you have rising powers such as India, Brazil, Japan, which don't hold permanent seats despite they're growing, maybe not Japan growing at the moment, but it's one of the world's biggest powers, growing economic and political influence. Similarly, Africa, which contains a large number of UN member states, more than any other continent, has no permanent representation in the Security Council. And this lack of broader representation diminishes the legitimacy of the Security Council in the eyes of many member states, particularly those from the Global South who feel their voices are marginalised in critical international decision-making processes, which continue to be dominated by the United States, by Russia, by China, by the United Kingdom, and by France. Therefore, actually, a lot of the time, the legitimacy of decisions can be disputed. There's also been, in large part due to this gridlock and due to the veto, really inconsistent response to global crises, largely driven by what's in the geopolitical interests of the P5 members. This creates a real perception of bias and often means inaction and a lack of certainty about whether the UN Security Council is going to be able to do anything. So it's intervened decisively in some conflicts, such as Libya in 2011 and also in Iraq in the 1990s. I think it was 1980s, I'm not quite sure, while remaining largely inactive or unable to respond to others. So the Syrian civil war, the civil war in Yemen that's ongoing, depending on the geopolitical interests of its permanent member states and their allies. And this undermines its credibility and erodes trust among UN member states. So when powerful countries use the UN Security Council as a platform for advancing their own national agendas and using their veto to prevent things that go against their own national interests, rather than actually focusing on what the UN Security Council is supposed to do to promote global peace and security, it weakens this kind of the real principles that the UN was founded on. And it often results in prolonged conflict, human suffering, and missed opportunities for effective conflict resolution. And crucially, often, a lot of the time, its resolutions and sanctions aren't effective in achieving their intended goals. So it can pass binding resolutions or impose sanctions, but enforcement is often weak and compliance can be inconsistent for member states. So sanctions can try and coerce states into compliance, but in many cases they actually fail, and the country where the sanctions are put on just ignores the sanctions. So a few examples of this: North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela have endured long-term sanctions with limited impact on their leadership or policies, and actually they just really harm the general population and force them deeper into poverty. Furthermore, the non-binding nature of some resolutions mean that states can choose to ignore them without facing direct repercussions. In terms of some case studies, then I thought I'd look at first some successful ones and then go into some less successful ones. And the successful one is a peacekeeping operation that was authorised in 2003 in Liberia, which at the time was in the throes of a civil war and there were widespread human rights abuses. And the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1509 establishing the United Nations mission in Liberia, which is a peacekeeping operation tasked with stabilising the country. It was successful in disarming over 100,000 combatants, supporting the peaceful transition to a democratic government, and facilitating the reintegration of displaced persons. So it was widely praised as being successful in helping Liberia transition from conflict to peace. Another case study, and this is a bit of a different one, is in relation to the India-Pakistan conflict over Kashmir, and it's a really old example, but it's actually one where the veto can be argued to be successful, because we're going to have a lot of examples of the veto being ineffective. I thought I'd give one from the other side as well. So in 1957, the UN Security Council discussed the ongoing dispute between India and Pakistan over the region of Kashmir. The US and UK at the time really supported a resolution that favoured Pakistan's position, calling for the demilitarisation of Kashmir and a plebiscite to determine its future. However, the Soviet Union used its veto power to block the resolution, arguing it unfairly favoured one party and could escalate tensions between India and Pakistan. The Soviet veto prevented what could have been a one-sided resolution from being enforced, which could have really deepened the conflict and led to significant tension between two nuclear-capable countries. So this could be argued that actually the fact that a veto means that no one of these P5 powerful states can be forced to do something that's against their interests can often actually, inaction can sometimes be good in preventing further escalation. Case study 3 is a bit of a mix in terms of success or failure, and that's sanctions on North Korea. So North Korea in 2006 had kind of started its nuclear program, and there were sanctions placed, agreed on by all of the P5 members and the UN Security Council that targeted North Koreans' access to weapons, luxury goods, and financial resources critical to its nuclear activities. They're a clear example. And so on the one hand, they're good because the Security Council united around a critical issue that was a threat to international peace and security. This being said, they haven't been really successful. They have hurt North Korea's economy, but as with a lot of sanctions, they haven't stopped it doing what it wanted, haven't curbed its nuclear ambitions, as the regime under Kim Jong-un continues to prioritise its weapons program over the well-being of its population. Case study 4, for me, this is the clearest example of the failure of the United Nations Security Council, and that's the Syrian civil war, where effectively it was a war that lasted over a decade, and because the United States and Russia were on opposite sides, Russia was a key ally of Bashar al-Assad's regime, whilst the US was largely in opposition to Assad's regime and also supported some Kurdish rebels in northern Syria. There was so much vetoing that nothing happened. It was a huge humanitarian crisis. Hundreds and thousands of people died in the conflict, but due to gridlock and the veto, nothing was done by the UN. Very little was done by the UN Security Council to offer humanitarian support or try and bridge the conflict or achieve peace, allowing the conflict to drag on for over a decade. This really shows how the veto can paralyse decision making, especially when major powers are deeply involved in the conflict. Another couple of examples in relation to this then are the US invasion of Iraq and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which both show the ineffectiveness of the UN Security Council in preventing very powerful states, particularly from P5 states, from doing what they want, even when it's against international law. So the Iraq War in 2003, effectively the United States bypassed the UN Security Council as it knew what it was doing was against international law and decided to simply do it anyway, despite the fact that France, Russia and China, 3 of the P5 members, had expressed opposition to military action, arguing that time should be given for inspections because the US and UK had a veto. They simply went ahead with it anyway, showing the limitations that the UN has in limiting its most powerful members. You can say very much the same for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So Russia launched a full-scale military invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and the UN Security Council immediately convened to discuss the situation, sought to pass a resolution condemning Russia's actions. Of course, Russia vetoed it, preventing the UN Security Council from taking any substantive action. Despite the fact that a vast majority of the international community, including most Security Council members, condemned the invasion. Because Russia had a veto, it prevented the Security Council from doing anything. And this demonstrates how the veto power can protect the interests of permanent members, even when that member state is the aggressor in a conflict, leading to gridlock and inaction. As a result, the UN General Assembly actually took the rare step of convening an emergency special session where it passed a non-binding resolution condemning the invasion. However, this didn't carry the same legal weight as a UN Security Council resolution. Okay, moving on now to the UN General Assembly. So the UN General Assembly is the main deliberative body of the United Nations, where all 193 member states are represented equally, each with one vote. So it's designed to provide a forum where all countries can come together to discuss and collaborate on international issues. It meets annually, providing a platform for diplomacy, negotiation, and the development of international norms. Its primary purpose is to promote that international cooperation on issues that face the whole of the international community, including peace, climate change, human rights, economic development. And each state, regardless of their size or power, has an equal voice in the UN General Assembly and an equal vote. So, how does it work? What does it do? So it holds annual sessions beginning in September, during which global leaders gather to address pressing international issues in the general debate. And it can also convene special sessions on urgent matters, such as it did after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, as we discussed. Key functions include passing resolutions, so it can adopt resolutions on a wide range of topics, including peace and security, international law, disarmament, human rights, and sustainable development. These aren't legally binding, crucially, but they can influence global norms and serve as the basis for international treaties and conventions, so they can have some impact. It also elects key officials in the UN, including the Secretary General, non-permanent members of the Security Council, and judges of the International Court of Justice, and it approves the UN budget. States cooperate and align with other states to pursue shared goals. For example, there are different groupings. So the non-aligned movement consists of 120 countries, primarily from the global south, with an interest in tackling inequality and promoting the interests of developing nations. So then, how important is the UN General Assembly then? It's often debated, with arguments. Some argue it has very little power and very little influence at all, whilst others actually argue it still plays a really critical role in global governance and international diplomacy. So starting off by having a look at some arguments that it isn't important. The main criticism of the UN General Assembly is that its resolutions are non-binding. Unlike the Security Council, which can pass legally enforceable resolutions, the General Assembly's decisions do not carry the force of law, meaning that member states aren't obligated to comply with its resolutions. This has led many to view it as a forum for debate rather than actual action. For example, Resolution 73/98 was passed in 2018, ruling that Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem and the West Bank, are illegal under international law. But this had no impact on the ground, as Israel wasn't required to comply. There was no military action as a result, which the UN Security Council could have authorised, obviously, if the US would always veto it. So that wouldn't have happened anyway. And yeah, because the US consistently vetoes binding measures, and because the UN General Assembly has no legally binding powers, ultimately a lot of its resolutions do very little at all. Another example is the General Assembly's kind of had numerous resolutions over the years against nuclear weapons, such as calling for global nuclear disarmament, which have not compelled nuclear powers to dismantle their arsenals or sign binding disarmament agreements. And this maybe reflects a realist perspective that states simply follow their own interests. So whatever the international community says in the UN General Assembly, if it's not legally binding and they don't have to do it, they're never going to drop one of the key sources of their power. So their UN General Assembly's resolutions often serve as symbolic gestures rather than tools for enforcing international law or resolving conflicts. On the other hand, it can be argued that the UN General Assembly is important. Whilst its resolutions may be non-binding, it provides a universal platform for all of the UN's member states to voice their concerns, which is essential for influencing the world to address key issues. So it can set moral and political standards that guide state behaviour. For example, the UN General Assembly came together to set out the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which wasn't legally binding, isn't legally enforceable, but really laid the groundwork for modern human rights law and has influenced numerous international treaties and national constitutions, which are then more legally binding, including the European Convention on Human Rights. Similarly, it's been instrumental in advancing sustainable development through its adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, before that the Millennium Development Goals in 2000. And while they're non-binding, everything's non-binding, they can galvanise global cooperation on key issues and bring the international community together to try and tackle key issues through the United Nations. And it crucially serves as a really important forum for diplomatic engagement. The annual debate allows leaders from all member states to present their views on the international challenges, and this helps ensure that the concerns of all nations, not just powerful nations, are heard, fostering a sense of global solidarity. For example, Cuban leader Fidel Castro used the 1960 general debate to criticise the US foreign policy, demonstrating how it allows smaller states to really criticise the most powerful countries in the world. And additionally, the UNGA selects the Secretary General, who often comes from smaller nations. For example, the current Secretary General is Antonio Guterres from Portugal. And crucially, they're non-binding, their resolutions, but these resolutions can apply moral pressure on states. For example, the condemnation of Russian invasion of Ukraine, which 141 countries voted in favour of, put some moral pressure and obviously make it more difficult for countries to transgress international law or the norms and values of the international community. So those two are really important UN institutions. There's also the Economic and Social Council, which I've really kept quite small because you really don't need to know that much of it. So it's one of the 6 main organs of the United Nations responsible for coordinating the UN's economic, social and environmental efforts. So 54 member states are elected by the General Assembly for 3-year terms, and its key purpose is to promote international economic and social cooperation and to advance the Sustainable Development Agenda. So it elects members to various specialised bodies and commissions which do a lot of work of the United Nations, such as the Commission on the Status of Women and the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. It also provides a platform for international government, intergovernmental organisations, non-governmental organisations, the private sector and countries to come together, cooperate and contribute to global development strategies. It reviews the progress of the UN on its sustainable development goals and coordinates the work of UN specialised agencies such as the World Health Organization, International Labour Organization, which do a lot of the actual then work of the United Nations. So it kind of really oversees that and coordinates it. And the final institution, key institution of the UN we're going to have a look at is the International Court of Justice. We're going to look at this when we look at global human rights governance as well. But we might as well look at it here as part of the United Nations. So if you watch both videos, you're going to be seeing this twice pretty much. The International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court, is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. Established with the UN Charter in 1945. It's based in The Hague in the Netherlands, and it's the only court of a universal character with the purpose of settling legal disputes between states. And it also provides advisory opinions on international legal issues referred to it by the United Nations. So it's composed of 15 judges elected by the UN General Assembly and Security Council, ensuring a balance of geographical representation. And its primary aim is to promote the peaceful resolution of international disputes. So it gives countries a way to come together and allow for that peaceful resolution by the International Court of Justice rather than resorting to war or violence. What then does it do? As I said, 2 key functions. The first one is settling disputes. So when states bring cases before the International Court of Justice, its role is to adjudicate based on international law and effectively decide who's broken the law. Only states can be parties in cases before the International Court of Justice, so internationals or organisations can't submit cases directly. And once a court reaches a decision, its judgments are binding and the states involved are expected to comply, although enforcement can sometimes be difficult, as state sovereignty means the ICJ can't enforce the rulings. It also issues advisory opinions at the request of the UN General Assembly. And this can be where, even when states don't bring cases to it, they don't, consent to being part of a case. And these are non-binding but carry significant legal and moral weight. On the one hand, it can be argued that the ICJ has limited influence, because states must consent to its jurisdiction for disputes to be heard and for rulings to be enforced. And if a state refuses to recognise the court's authority or declines to just implement its rulings, there are few mechanisms to compel compliance because it doesn't have a global police force. Additionally, advisory opinions issued by the ICJ are non-binding, meaning that states can ignore them without facing legal consequences. We've got some examples here. In relation to Russia and Ukraine in 2022, the ICJ issued an advisory opinion ordering Russia to immediately halt its military operations in Ukraine. Russia just refused to comply. It was a non-binding resolution. Even if it was theoretically binding, Russia would have not done anything anyway. 1986 then, the United States and Nicaragua. In a landmark case, the ICJ ruled that the United States had violated international law by supporting Contra rebels in Nicaragua under Ronald Reagan. However, the US rejected the court's jurisdiction, even though it had jurisdiction in the case, and refused to comply with the ruling, demonstrating how powerful states can just simply ignore ICJ decisions, even if they're theoretically legally binding, when they're not in their interests. On the other hand, we've got some arguments, a key argument and some examples suggest that the ICJ does have significant influence. So the ICJ's rulings often carry significant moral and political weight, creating pressure on states to comply. The court's judgments set important legal precedents that influence international relations and the behaviour of states, and even its advisory opinions, though non-binding, provide guidance on complex legal issues and help clarify international law. So there are places where it has had influence. For example, it ruled in 2014 that Japan's whaling program in the Southern Ocean was not for scientific purposes, as it claimed, and ordered Japan to halt the practice, and it complied with the ruling. It also settled some key disputes, such as Costa Rica and Nicaragua in 2018, where there was a territorial dispute over the San Juan River. The ICJ ruled in favour of Costa Rica, required Nicaragua to compensate it for environmental damage, which it ultimately did, and both states complied. And you have exactly the same with Democratic Republic of the Congo and Uganda, where there was a long-standing case regarding Uganda's military intervention in the DRC during the late 1990s, which the ICJ argued was against international law and required Uganda to pay reparations to the DRC for damages caused by violations of that international law. And the first payment has been made, the judgment is complied with. So ultimately, sometimes it has an impact, as shown here, sometimes it doesn't, and as often you'll see it comes up in a theme throughout these videos and throughout the global politics section of the A Level Politics specification. Is the powerful states who often can say no, and the less powerful states where it often can be legally binding for. So yeah, I hope that was useful. As I said, you can get questions just on the United Nations. You can get questions in the 12 marks comparing it to other institutions, but also this content on the United Nations, especially on the Security Council and the General Assembly, is really useful to bring into different questions as well. These examples, this evidence, will often be relevant to different parts of the course, and lots of questions you could get in the exam. Let me know in the comment section if you've got any questions or comments, and I'll get back to you, and I'll see you in the next video.